A father and his daughter were sharing a small sandwich at the bus stop when a wealthy woman stepped out of her luxury car, pulled out a sum of money from her purse, and made a strange demand that left everyone shocked. But what she asked for was far from normal. It was humiliating and left the father frozen, torn between his pride and his daughter's needs. What could drive a woman of such wealth to target a man who had already lost everything? Stay tuned to discover the unexpected truth behind this unlikely encounter. The morning in Redwood City was gray, with a sky weighed down by clouds that seemed to reflect the burden of the day in Eustace's life. He was sitting on the rusty bench of a worn-out bus stop, with his 9-year-old daughter, Mara, beside him. She hunched her shoulders under a thin coat, her gaze distant as she held half of a small sandwich that her father had managed to buy with the money from a recent odd job. Eustace chewed slowly, his eyes alert to the hurried people passing by, wrapped up in their own worlds. Luxury cars cruised the streets, a stark contrast to the reality of those waiting at the stop. "Dad, why do people never look over here?" Mara asked, her voice weak but filled with curiosity. Eustace tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "Because they're busy, sweetheart. Everyone has their own problems." Silence settled between them again, interrupted only by the sound of honking horns and muffled footsteps. Mara's head rested on her father's shoulder, and he felt the heat of fever radiating through the fabric of her coat. He sighed, silently worrying about how he would manage to get enough money to buy the medicine she needed. The previous night had been tough. Mara had coughed all night, and the dark circles under her small eyes were evident. Soon after, a black luxury car pulled up next to the bus stop. A tall, elegantly dressed woman stepped out, the heels of her shoes echoing on the sidewalk. Octavia. Her presence immediately captured everyone's attention, but her eyes were fixed on Eustace and Mara. Eustace recognized her face immediately, though he didn't know from where. Something in her expression unsettled him. She approached slowly, examining them from head to toe with a mix of disdain and interest. "You look like someone who would do anything for money," Octavia said, her tone cold and calculated. Eustace frowned, feeling his blood boil but held back. He had no choice but to listen. "What do you want from me?" She pointed at the tires of her immaculate car. "My tires are filthy, clean them. I'll pay $50 for the service here and now." Shock coursed through Eustace's body like an electric shock. He felt the eyes of other passengers at the bus stop on him, some curious, others filled with pity. Mara looked at her father, confused as she squeezed his hand. "Dad, you don't have to do this, do you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eustace hesitated, the humiliation burning in his chest. But then Mara coughed, a weak, muffled sound that filled him with dread. He knew he needed that money, not just for the medicine, but to buy something decent to feed his daughter. His eyes met Octavia's. There was something cruel and personal in the way she looked at him, as if the act of offering money was a kind of punishment. "Do you accept or not?" Octavia crossed her arms, impatient. Eustace lowered his head, feeling an unbearable weight crush his dignity. "I accept." Without saying anything more, Octavia tossed a dirty cloth on the ground beside him. Eustace took a deep breath, knelt on the sidewalk, and began to clean the shiny tires of the car. His hands trembled as he scrubbed away the grime, listening to murmurs around him. Some laughed, others just looked on with pity. He avoided looking at Mara, who stood there, hugging herself with a look of sadness that he couldn't bear to confront. When he finished, Octavia extended the money, but held it for a moment before handing it over. "Remember, sometimes you have to lower your head to survive. Maybe you already know that." Eustace took the money without responding, shame sticking to his skin like a cold sweat. Octavia returned to her car, starting the engine without looking back. Mara held her father's arm as he stood up, her gaze filled with something that broke his heart. It wasn't just sadness, but also a childish doubt. "Why did you do that, Dad?" she asked as they walked back home. Eustace didn't know how to answer. He knew Mara was too young to understand the weight of his choices, but old enough to feel their impact. Later, in the small apartment where they lived, Eustace gave Mara the medicine he had bought with the money. The space was cramped and poorly lit, with peeling walls and a constant smell of mildew. The girl swallowed the pills in silence, watching her father with eyes that seemed larger than they should for her age. He tried to avoid her gaze as he prepared a simple soup, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. "Dad, didn't you feel bad?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Eustace placed the bowl in front of her and sat down. He ran his hands through his hair, exhausted and unsure how to explain. "Mara, sometimes we do things we don't like because we have to." "But why did that woman do that? She seemed mean." Eustace shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe she has her reasons." Mara didn't seem convinced. "You shouldn't let anyone treat you like that, Dad." He sighed, holding her small hand. "I'll do whatever it takes to take care of you, Mara, even if it hurts." The girl lowered her eyes, gripping the spoon tightly. She didn't respond, but Eustace noticed the discreet tears streaming down her face. He knew he was failing, that no matter how hard he tried, the weight of their circumstances always seemed to crush him. Outside, Octavia watched Eustace's building from inside her car, parked discreetly around the corner. Her face was tense, and her eyes seemed filled with memories that no one else could see. She gripped the steering wheel tightly as her lips curved into a thin line. It wasn't just contempt she felt, there was something deeper, something personal that consumed her. With a long sigh, she revved the engine and disappeared into the night. Eustace had no idea that his life was about to change, and that the weight of his past would be used against him in ways he could never imagine. Mara slept beside him, breathing heavily, while he stared at the ceiling, unable to find peace in his thoughts. The muffled sound of the alarm clock in Eustace's small room signaled the start of another day of struggle. He quickly turned off the alarm so as not to wake Mara, whose cough had worsened during the night. The weak sunlight filtered through the worn curtain, illuminating the cracks in the ceiling. Eustace glanced at his daughter, curled up under a thin blanket, her pale face marked by a persistent fever. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his chest once again. Putting on his old jacket, he quietly left the apartment, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the poorly maintained corridors of the building. He knew he needed to find work that day, anything that would be enough to supplement the money he had made the day before and secure Mara's medicine. On the street, the contrast was evident. The city buzzed with its luxury shops and hurried residents, starkly juxtaposed with the reality of those like him who were merely fighting to survive. After walking for nearly an hour, he stumbled upon a construction site where workers were hauling debris to parked trucks. "Need help?" Eustace asked the supervisor, trying to mask the exhaustion in his voice. The man glanced at him briefly, showing little interest. "You can start. We pay by the hour. Can you keep up?" Eustace nodded, though he knew his tired body would struggle to keep pace. He grabbed a wheelbarrow and began transporting chunks of concrete and wood. Hours dragged by slowly, each trip to the truck becoming heavier than the last. During a brief break, he noticed one of the workers approaching. It was a sturdy man with short hair and a weary look. He introduced himself as Laurent. "First time here?" Laurent asked, lighting a cigarette and offering one to Eustace, who politely declined. "Yeah, just looking for temporary work. My daughter is sick. I need money." Laurent let out a bitter laugh. "It's always like that, isn't it? We all have someone to care for. I have 3 kids and I can barely pay the rent." The two men chatted briefly during the break. Laurent shared that, like Eustace, he was also facing constant financial difficulties. The exchange of stories created a momentary connection, a brief relief amid the weight of their lives. But soon the supervisor called everyone back to work, and the conversation ended. At the end of the day, Eustace received his payment, a small amount, but it would be useful. He thanked the supervisor, and before leaving, Laurent called him aside. "If you need more work, come back tomorrow. They always need someone to haul stuff around here." Thanks, Laurent. I'll keep that in mind. Eustace shook his hand and left. When he got home, the scene hadn't changed. Mara was lying on the makeshift mattress in the living room, her face still feverish. Eustace's heart tightened at the sight of her so fragile, but he tried to smile as he showed her the small bag of groceries he had bought. "I brought soup, sweetheart. It will help you get stronger." Mara simply nodded, too weak to respond. Eustace sat beside her, holding her small, cold hand. He knew he needed more money to buy proper medicine and maybe even take her to a doctor, but the little he had earned wasn't enough. Guilt and despair consumed him in silence. The next day, while Mara slept, Eustace decided to go out again to look for odd jobs. He stopped by a supermarket to buy something cheap for Mara. He was distracted, thinking about how to stretch the money, when a familiar voice interrupted him. "Back again, are you?" It was Octavia. She stood there with a cart full of groceries dressed in elegant clothes, her expression a mix of disdain and curiosity. Eustace tried to ignore her, but she pressed on. "I need help packing this up and taking it to my car. I'm willing to pay $50. Interested?" He felt his blood boil. It was clear she was provoking him, that she didn't need his help. But at the same time, the $50 could make a difference for Mara. The image of his sick daughter at home haunted him, and he knew he couldn't refuse. "All right," he finally said, trying to maintain some dignity as he lifted the items from the cart. Octavia watched his every move, as if assessing his performance. When they reached her car, she opened the trunk and crossed her arms. "You know, don't you? Life is about choices. Some people choose misery." Eustace paused for a moment, holding one of the heavier bags. "Some people don't have a choice." Octavia didn't respond immediately. She simply handed over the money, but not before casting a cold, piercing glance. "Make sure it's worth it." Eustace didn't reply. He took the money, squeezing it tightly in his hand, and quickly walked away from the supermarket, feeling the humiliation weigh on his shoulders. He knew he was being tested, but he didn't understand why. What did that woman really want from him? Later, at the construction site, while hauling more debris, Eustace ran into Laurent again. They exchanged brief words during another break, and Laurent mentioned something that made Eustace's heart race. "Hey, you know that rich woman you mentioned? Octavia, right? I think I've heard of her. I'm not sure, but it seems she's the daughter of one of the owners of that factory that burned down years ago. The same one you worked at, isn't it?" Eustace froze for a moment. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead as he processed the words. "Are you sure about that?" Laurent shrugged. "That's what I heard. Makes sense, doesn't it? Maybe she holds some grudge." Eustace felt the world around him tremble. He tried to mask his reaction, but the weight of that information hit him like a punch to the stomach. If Octavia really was the daughter of someone linked to the tragedy at the factory, it explained a lot. He began to piece things together, but what did she want from him? Eustace had no answers, only more questions, and the feeling that his past was about to collide with his present in a way he wasn't prepared to face.
Thank you for watching so far. If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and continue bringing you more emotional stories. Let's continue.
Eustace's walk back to the apartment was silent, but his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Laurent's words echoed in his head. Was Octavia really the daughter of someone connected to the factory fire? If that were true, it would explain the bitterness in her eyes, but it didn't justify the constant humiliation. He needed to understand the reason behind her behavior, but for now, his priority was Mara. When he opened the apartment door, he found Mrs. Adeline, his elderly neighbor, in the small kitchen space. She was stirring a pot of steaming soup that exuded a comforting aroma. Mara, sitting on the sofa, watched with a shy smile, her face still pale from fever. "Oh, there you are, Eustace. I thought you might need something warm. This girl looks like she could use some strength. And you do too, it seems, Mrs. Adeline said in her soft yet firm voice. Eustace tried to refuse out of embarrassment. Mrs. Adeline, I can't accept. Nonsense. I made too much for myself. It's just soup, Eustace. I won't run out, she replied, cutting off any attempts at argument. Mara smiled at her father and held his hand. Thank you, Daddy. I was hungry. Eustace felt his eyes welling up. He sat beside his daughter, watching as the neighbors served a bowl for each of them. Mara took small sips, still weak but clearly relieved by the meal. You're lucky to have a girl like her, Adeline commented, watching Mara. She's special, I know. I want to be a doctor or a teacher one day, Mara said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but determined. That way I can help people, just like you're helping me now. Eustace tried to smile, but the guilt over Mara's uncertain future weighed heavily on him. He knew that under their current circumstances, his daughter's dreams seemed impossible. However, he decided not to let that show. You can be anything you want, Mara. Just keep dreaming. Adeline smiled, but her expression was filled with concern. Well, I'll leave you two alone now. If you need anything else, just call me. Once the neighbor left, Eustace stayed by Mara's side, talking about simple things to distract her. He watched her with tenderness, feeling the weight of his helplessness. Mara had hope, even in the face of adversity, and that only intensified his desire to fight. The next morning, Eustace left early to try for a spot at the public hospital, taking Mara with him. The place was packed, with people crammed into the corridors and overworked nurses everywhere. He waited for hours, holding Mara's hand as she dozed off, her head resting on his shoulder. While waiting, a familiar figure caught his eye. Octavia was outside the hospital, talking to someone on the phone. She wore an elegant dress and sunglasses, completely out of place in the chaotic environment. Eustace tried to ignore her, but he knew she had seen him. When he stepped outside for some fresh air, she approached him. Still trying to deal with the consequences of your choices, Eustace, she said, her tone acidic. He took a deep breath, trying to contain his anger. What do you want, Octavia? She smiled sarcastically. Nothing, just thought it was interesting to see you here. This place is cramped, disorganized, and inefficient. Not exactly where people solve their problems. I don't have another option, Eustace replied firmly. Maybe you do, she said, leaning slightly toward him. I know private doctors. I can help you get an appointment for your daughter. Of course, you know it doesn't come free. Eustace narrowed his eyes, anticipating what would come next. What do you want now? Octavia smiled, pulling a small cardboard sign from her bag. On it, in large black letters, it read, I am a failure. I want you to hold this for half an hour, right here in front of the hospital. Just that. Imagine the impact it will have on the people around you. It'll be like a performance, a work of social art, she said, her sweetness feigned. Eustace felt his blood boil. He couldn't believe the cruelty of that woman. You've lost your mind. This is humiliating. It's a small price to pay to ensure your daughter's health, don't you think? She looked at him coldly. Or would you rather go back to the line and wait another day or two for care? He was about to refuse when he heard Mara's voice, who had come out looking for him. Daddy, what's going on? Octavia turned to Mara with a calculating smile. Oh, your girl is delightful. I hope she understands how far you're willing to go for her. Mara looked at the sign and then at her father, her eyes filled with tears. Daddy, please don't do this. We can wait. Eustace was torn. He knew Mara needed immediate care, but the thought of exposing himself like that, especially in front of her, was devastating. He looked at his daughter, who was now holding his hand tightly, and felt the weight of that choice crushing his soul. I have to do this, Mara, he said, his voice trembling. It's for your own good. She began to cry, hugging him tightly. Please no, I don't want you to hurt yourself like this. Eustace closed his eyes, trying to stay strong. He had no other choice. He took the sign from Octavia's hands and walked to the front of the hospital. With his face burning in shame, he held the sign, feeling the stares of pity and scorn from the people around him. Octavia stood at a distance, watching with a slight smile of satisfaction. When the time was up, she walked over and placed an envelope in his hand. "Here's what I promised. I hope you use it wisely." Eustace said nothing. He simply lowered the sign, took a deep breath, and returned to Mara. She hugged him tightly, her face wet with tears, and said through sobs, "You didn't have to do this, Daddy. I just want you to be okay." He held her close, trying to hide the tears now streaming down his own face. Octavia watched the scene from afar, but before getting into her car, she whispered to herself, "I won't stop until he pays for everything." Eustace heard the sound of Octavia's car pulling away and felt a knot in his stomach. That woman had a motive, a deep-seated grudge, and he needed to uncover what it was. The past he was trying to forget was getting closer, and he feared that this time there would be no escaping its consequences. The streets were nearly deserted when Eustace left home that morning. The cold air wrapped around his shoulders like a constant reminder of the weight he carried. He didn't say anything to Mara. He simply left a note on the table with instructions for her to stay inside and wait for the soup that Mrs. Adeline would surely bring. His daughter needed to rest, and he needed answers. The walk to the ruins of the old factory was slow and filled with painful memories. Each step seemed to pull him back into the past, to the days when he wore the uniform of a junior inspector and believed he could build a solid future for his family. But the fire changed everything. He pushed the memories away with a sigh, crossing through the rusty gate that led to the abandoned site. The smell of rust and ashes still lingered in the air, even years later. The debris was overgrown with tall grass, but some burned structures still stood like monuments to a tragedy. Eustace stopped in front of what had once been the cafeteria, now reduced to rubble and twisted beams. He remembered how that space used to be filled with laughter and animated conversations. But on that fateful morning, it all ended in screams and choking smoke. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the memories to wash over him. The meeting with management, weeks before the fire, came back to his mind. He had warned about the electrical system, mentioned the exposed wires and frequent short circuits. But his superiors silenced him, saying that the cost of repairs was too high. "Do your job and leave the bigger decisions to us," they had said. He tried to insist, but the fear of losing his job paralyzed him. After all, he had Mara and his wife Clara to support. "I should have done more," he murmured to himself, his voice heavy with regret. A voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. "You're not the only one who thinks that way." Eustace turned quickly, finding Mr. Caldwell, a former supervisor from the factory. The man was older, with gray hair and a tired expression, but still conveyed a natural authority. "Caldwell?" Eustace asked, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same, but I think I know the answer," Caldwell replied, crossing his arms as he looked at the ruins. "I come back here from time to time. I'm not sure why. Perhaps to remember that some things should never have happened." Eustace nodded, still processing the unexpected presence of his former colleague. Caldwell took a few steps forward, stopping next to a pile of broken concrete. "I remember you, Eustace," Caldwell began. "You were one of the few who actually cared about what was happening here. It doesn't surprise me to see you here now, but why exactly did you come?" Eustace hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm trying to understand everything. The fire, what I could have done differently, and more recently why a woman seems to hate me for something I might not have even done." Caldwell frowned. "A woman?" "Octavia," Eustace said. "She was the daughter of the factory owner, wasn't she? Or something like that." Caldwell let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand over his face. "Yes, she was. Her father, Mr. Bennett, was the largest shareholder. He was in the building on the day of the fire. He couldn't get out in time." Eustace felt a tightness in his chest. He had never known the exact details about the victims of that day, only that several colleagues had lost their lives. The revelation that Octavia's father was among them made everything click into place. "She thinks I'm to blame, doesn't she?" Eustace asked, his voice low. Caldwell looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Maybe. She lost a lot that day. Not just her father, but also her financial security. Her family was ruined. I've heard she holds a grudge against some people who worked here, especially those who knew about the problems and did nothing." "But I tried to warn them," Eustace said, a lump in his throat. "I warned you. I warned everyone." "And I confirmed that at the time," Caldwell said. "But the decisions weren't in our hands. You know that. The owners wanted to save money. They chose to ignore the risks." "And did that change anything?" Eustace asked, frustration spilling over. "They're dead, and now I'm an easy target for her rage." Caldwell placed a hand on Eustace's shoulder. "I know you're being unfairly blamed, and if you ever need me to tell the truth, I'll be there." Caldwell's offer brought a temporary relief, but it didn't lift the weight Eustace felt. He thanked the supervisor and left the site with a mix of emotions. Walking back home, he wondered how he would confront Octavia with this new information, or if he should at all. When he got home, he found Mara playing with an old notebook, trying to draw something. She smiled when she saw him, but he noticed that the smile was weaker than usual. "Hi, Dad, where did you go?" she asked, curious. "I went to think a bit," he replied, sitting down next to her. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Mrs. Adeline brought tea and stayed with me for a while," said Mara. "Are you sad?" Eustace didn't answer right away. He stroked her hair and tried to smile. "Just thinking about some complicated things, but don't worry, okay? Everything is fine." Mara hugged him, and Eustace closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of that moment. He knew he needed to protect her at all costs, but the shadow of Octavia and the past continued to loom over them. Eustace wondered how long it would be until the truth was finally revealed, and if it would be enough to end the torment surrounding them. As he reflected, a knock at the door broke him from his thoughts. Upon opening it, he found an envelope discreetly placed on the floor. Picking it up, he saw that there was no sender, just a single word written on the back: Justice. Inside, an old newspaper clipping featured a photo of Octavia and her father with the caption, "The Bennett family, proud shareholders of Red Mill Industries." Eustace felt his stomach churn. It was clear that someone was toying with him, but who and why? The past seemed more alive than ever, and Eustace knew that his fight was only just beginning. The truth about the fire, Octavia's hatred, and his own role in this story were about to collide in ways he never imagined. The envelope was still in his hands when Mara approached, her brow furrowed with concern. "Dad, what is this?" she asked, trying to catch a glimpse of its contents. Eustace quickly tucked the paper into his pocket, hiding any trace of his distress. "It's just something someone left for me, nothing to worry about," he replied, forcing a smile that barely held. He knew he couldn't carry that weight alone for long, but telling the truth to his daughter felt too cruel. That morning, Mara still seemed downcast. Despite Mrs. Adeline's soup and her father's constant care, her weakness was evident. When Eustace suggested going to the community bazaar to pick up some supplies, she hesitated. "I don't want you to humiliate yourself again, Dad," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Not for me." Eustace knelt in front of her, holding her tiny hands. "Mara, you don't understand. Everything I do is for you. No matter what I have to go through, as long as you have what you need to get better." His voice faltered, and Mara didn't respond, but she hugged him tightly. They stayed that way for a moment, just feeling the weight of the world in silence. When they arrived at the bazaar, the atmosphere was bustling. People of all ages were trading objects, used clothes, and food. Eustace carried a bag with some old tools he hoped to exchange for something useful. Mara, still weak, held his hand firmly, watching everything around her with tired, wide eyes. As they searched for something they could take home, a commotion caught everyone's attention. A luxury car parked at the entrance, and out stepped Octavia, accompanied by 2 aides. Dressed in a pristine outfit, she walked through the bazaar as if inspecting the place. Her eyes quickly found Eustace, and a cold smile appeared on her lips. Eustace tried to ignore her, but he had no chance. She approached, deliberately drawing attention. "Oh, Eustace, what a surprise to see you here. Always in search of something, aren't you?" Her voice was smooth but laced with venom. He didn't respond, gripping Mara's hand as he tried to continue down the aisle, but Octavia wouldn't let him escape so easily. She stopped by a table with water bottles and turned to him. "Actually, I need someone to serve the people. You could help me out, couldn't you? It's a simple job, and who knows, I might reward you." Eustace felt his blood boil, but he knew he couldn't create a public confrontation there. Mara looked at him, and he saw the silent plea in her eyes. "Please don't do this," she whispered, but he was already caving. "Sure," he said, his voice low. "I can help." Octavia smiled with a sick satisfaction. "Great, let's get started then." She called attention to everyone at the bazaar, announcing that Eustace would be responsible for serving water to the attendees. The humiliation was instantaneous. People who knew him watched with expressions of pity or disdain as he held the tray and began distributing the bottles. With each bottle handed out, Eustace felt his dignity being ripped away. Octavia made a point to comment loudly about how nice it was to give opportunities to people like him. At one point, as he passed by her, she placed a bill on the tray, saying in an exaggerated tone, "Here's a tip for your services. I hope it helps." Some neighbors began to murmur in protest. "This is too much," a man said. "She can't treat him like that." But Eustace didn't react. He looked at Mara, who was watching him from a distance, tears streaming down her face. He knew he had to endure. When he finally finished, Octavia called him over. "Very well, Eustace, you did a good job, but you know, this is just the beginning. You still have a lot to make up for." She smiled, but there was something cruel in her expression. Before she could leave, Eustace followed her. "Octavia, can we talk in private?" She hesitated but motioned for him to follow her to a more secluded area. Once they were away from the others, he looked her in the eye, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. "Why are you doing this? What did I do to deserve this treatment?" Octavia crossed her arms, her gaze icy. "You know very well what you did, Eustace. My father died in that fire, and you were there. You knew the danger and did nothing. You let him die." Eustace felt the ground disappear beneath him. Her words were like knives stabbing into his chest. "I tried to warn everyone," he said, his voice heavy with pain. "I did what I could, but no one listened to me. I was just an employee, Octavia. I had no power to change anything." She laughed, but there was no joy in her sound. "That's what you say now, but you know what I see. A man who preferred to save his job over saving lives. My father was one of the victims, and my family has never recovered from that. You deserve every humiliation I can throw at you." Eustace felt tears welling up, but he held them back. "Do you think this brings me peace? Do you think I don't blame myself every single day? I carry that weight, Octavia, and you don't know what it's like to live with it." She regarded him for a moment, her eyes shining with conflicting emotions. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't know. But that doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't change how I feel." When she turned to leave, Eustace stood still, trying to process everything. He knew he had to do something to prove his innocence, not just for himself, but for Mara. He thought of Caldwell and the promise the man had made to help him, but the idea of confronting Octavia directly filled him with hesitation. He returned to Mara, who ran to hug him. "Daddy, please don't do this anymore," she pleaded. "You don't have to." Eustace looked at his daughter and felt a determination rising within him. He needed to end this once and for all. But how? And what else could Octavia be hiding in her heart? Eustace felt Mara's tight embrace still resonating in his chest as they walked back home. She was exhausted, her eyes downcast and her breathing heavy, but she was making a visible effort not to let on just how much she was suffering. Upon arriving at their small apartment, Eustace laid her down on the bed, tucking the blanket around her like armor against the cold seeping through the poorly sealed windows.
"Dad, you don't have to keep doing this. Please don't go after that woman again," Mara said, her voice weak but firm. Her eyes were filled with tears she was trying to hold back, as if she didn't want to add to the weight her father was already carrying.
Eustace sat beside her, holding her small hand. "I just want you to be okay, Mara. Nothing matters more than that. If I have to go through tough things to ensure you get better, I will."
"But it hurts you too," she insisted, her eyes pleading for a promise he knew he couldn't give. He kissed her forehead and murmured, "I promise I'll think of another way." But the words sounded empty even to him. The next morning, Eustace decided to try again to find a job. He put on his best shirt, which was already starting to fade, and left early, leaving Mara in the care of their neighbor, Mrs. Adeline. He knew the options were limited, but he refused to give up. After all, finding something stable was the only way to escape the cycle of humiliation he was trapped in. After knocking on several doors, Eustace finally arrived at a commercial building that was hiring a janitor. The manager seemed hesitant from the start, but agreed to a brief interview. During the conversation, Eustace felt he was doing well until the man mentioned, almost casually, "I heard you have a history of taking jobs, let's say, outside the norm. That won't be a problem here, will it?" Eustace felt his face burn. He knew exactly what the man was implying. He tried to defend himself, explaining that he had done what was necessary to take care of his daughter, but the manager merely nodded vaguely, ending the interview with a polite yet empty smile. Eustace left the building feeling more defeated than ever. As he walked back, he ran into Laurent on a corner, carrying bags of cement for a nearby construction site. "Eustace, you don't look well at all. What happened?" Laurent asked, setting the bags down for a moment. "I tried for a janitor position, but it seems my reputation is haunting me," Eustace replied, sighing deeply. "I don't know what else I can do." Laurent looked at him seriously, and after a moment said, "I heard about a job in another city. It's tough work, but it pays well. Maybe it's a chance to start over." Eustace frowned. "Another city? I can't just take Mara and leave. She's sick, and the trip would be too hard on her." "I know," Laurent replied in a tone of understanding, "but think about it. It might be your only way out." Back at the apartment, Eustace found Mara sleeping deeply, still breathing heavily. He sat beside her, running his fingers through her hair as he reflected on what Laurent had said. A radical change could be the answer, but the fear of putting Mara in danger during the journey paralyzed him. He closed his eyes, struggling against the feeling of helplessness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. That night, while trying to formulate some kind of plan, the cheap cell phone he used vibrated with a message. The number wasn't saved, but he knew exactly who it was upon reading the cold words on the screen. "Charity event tomorrow night at Westwood Hall. Attend. I promise a significant amount if you do what I ask." It was Octavia, and his stomach churned at the thought of what she might be planning this time. Westwood Hall was known for its sophistication, and he couldn't imagine anything less than a monumental public humiliation. He deleted the message, but the words continued to echo in his mind. The next morning, Mara noticed her father's restlessness and pressed him to know what was going on. "It's about that woman again, isn't it? She wants you to do something horrible, doesn't she?" Eustace hesitated, but knew he couldn't lie. "She offered me money to attend an event. I don't know what she will ask, but the money would be enough to pay for your tests and maybe even better treatment." Mara shook her head vehemently, her eyes shining with indignation. "I don't want that, Dad. I'd rather stay like this than see you degrade yourself further. Please don't go." Her sincerity broke Eustace's heart, but he knew he was running out of options. "I'll try to find another solution," he promised, though he felt those words were just echoes of the empty promises he had made before.
While he struggled with his decision, Eustace received an unexpected visit that afternoon. Caldwell, the former supervisor from the factory, showed up at the apartment door. "We need to talk, Eustace," he said, his expression grim. Eustace invited him in, offering a seat at the small kitchen table. Caldwell seemed tense as he spoke. "I heard Octavia is putting pressure on you, and this charity event, well, let's just say it's not just about charity. She could use it to destroy your reputation publicly. You need to be prepared." "Why would she do that?" Eustace asked, although he already knew the answer. "She thinks I'm responsible for what happened to her father, but I tried to warn about the risks. You know that, Caldwell." "I know," Caldwell replied, "and that's why I'm here. If she tries to accuse you of something, I'll be there to testify. I can't let you carry that guilt alone." Eustace felt a pang of hope, but also fear. And what if she doesn't stop? Even with the truth, she could keep pursuing me. Caldwell nodded slowly. "You're right. She's filled with bitterness, and that can blind her. But the truth still matters, Eustace, and I'll stand by your side." After Caldwell left, Eustace stared at the door for a long time, trying to gather the courage to face what was to come. He knew that the decision he made now wouldn't just affect his life, but also Mara's. And as she slept in the next room, he wondered if he would have the strength to protect both his dignity and his daughter at the same time. The event at Westwood Hall was tomorrow, and he needed to decide whether he would confront Octavia once more or seek another way out. For now, the only certainty was the fear of what she might do to complete her revenge.
Your support means everything to us. Don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to help our channel reach more people. Thank you for being here. Now back to the story.
Eustace sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the only shirt he still owned that looked somewhat acceptable. The garment was slightly yellowed with age, but he put it on carefully, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest. Mara, lying on the bed next to him, looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "You don't have to go, Daddy," she said, her voice low and choked. "Please don't do this." Eustace took a deep breath, trying to convey a calmness he didn't feel. "I have to go, Mara. It's for you. Maybe this will be the last time." She turned her face away, unable to look at her father, preparing for yet another night of humiliation. "You always say that," she whispered, almost inaudibly. He wanted to respond, but he knew no words would make a difference. He dressed in the shirt and the only pair of shoes he had left, trying to ignore the stains on the laces and the wear on the soles. As he leaned down to kiss Mara's forehead, she grabbed his hand tightly as if she wanted to hold him there forever. Eustace felt the weight of guilt on his shoulders, but he pulled away, murmuring, "I'll be back soon." Outside, the night was cold. He walked toward the Westwood Hall, each step heavier than the last. When he finally arrived, the grand golden gates of the venue loomed before him like a barrier between two worlds, the world of the lavish guests, laughing and drinking champagne inside, and his own where survival was the only priority. The security guards watched him with looks oscillating between disdain and curiosity, but upon checking his name on the list, they allowed him entry. As he passed through the doors, Eustace was hit by the sparkle of crystal chandeliers and the sound of a softly playing orchestra in the background. Women in extravagant dresses and men in impeccable suits moved around the hall, laughing and exchanging greetings as if they owned the world. Eustace felt sweat trickling down his forehead but kept his chin up. "Ah, he's arrived." Octavia's voice cut through the air like a blade. She stood near the stage, surrounded by other guests. Dressed in a sleek black gown, the cold smile on her face made Eustace shudder. "You're a bit late," she said as she approached him. "I hope that's not a habit." Eustace remained silent, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. Octavia tilted her head, assessing him as if he were an object for sale. "Follow me," she ordered, not waiting for a response. She led him to the stage, where a microphone awaited him at the center. The bright lights shone intensely there, spotlighting anyone brave enough to step up. Octavia turned to Eustace and said, in a low but loaded tone, "You know what to do. Step up, take the microphone, and tell everyone that you were responsible for the fire. Admit that you ignored the electrical faults for convenience. Do this and the money will be yours." Eustace felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He looked at Octavia, hoping to find some trace of humanity in her eyes, but all he saw was an abyss of bitterness and vengeance. "You want me to lie?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I want you to pay," she replied without hesitation. The hall began to quiet down as the guests sensed the rising tension. All eyes turned to Eustace, who remained frozen in place, unable to move. He thought of Mara, of her fragile health, of her dreams for a better future. He thought of her look when she begged him not to go. And then he thought of the crushing weight of shame he felt each time he bent to Octavia's demands. Slowly, he began to walk toward the stage. Each step felt like a torment, and the silence in the hall became deafening. When he finally reached the microphone, Eustace looked out at the sea of unfamiliar faces, all waiting for some kind of spectacle. He took a deep breath, feeling his throat tighten. He began, but his voice failed him. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I want to say something about that fire." Before he could continue, a loud voice echoed through the hall. "Wait!" Everyone turned to see Caldwell rushing in, holding a thick folder. He climbed onto the stage, ignoring Octavia's protests, who now appeared nervous for the first time. Caldwell positioned himself beside Eustace and raised the folder for all to see. "I'm Caldwell, former supervisor of the factory where Eustace worked," he started, his voice steady, "and I'm here to say that this man is not guilty for the fire. He tried to alert management about the electrical faults, but was ignored. I have documents here that prove it." A murmur swept through the hall as Caldwell opened the folder and displayed detailed reports. These are the records of the alerts he made. They are proof that the board was aware of the risks, but chose to prioritize profits over safety. Eustace is as much a victim as anyone else in that tragedy. Octavia stood frozen, her face rigid as Caldwell continued to speak. Her father, who was one of the factory owners, was involved in the decisions that ignored the alerts. He is no less guilty than anyone on that board. The hall fell into absolute silence. Eustace looked at Octavia, waiting for some reaction, but she seemed to have frozen in place. Caldwell turned to him and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry this weight alone, Eustace," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Eustace felt tears streaming down his face as the hall erupted into murmurs and questions. He looked out at the crowd, unsure of what to say, until he finally found his voice. "All I wanted was to take care of my daughter," he said, his voice choked. "I tried to do the right thing, but I couldn't save anyone. I just hope that now the truth has finally been heard." Octavia stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Caldwell. "That doesn't change anything," she said, though her voice trembled. "My father is dead, and nothing will bring him back." "But that doesn't give you the right to destroy another life," Caldwell replied, looking directly at her. Octavia stepped back, speechless, as the hall remained in a state of shock. Eustace felt his legs weaken, and he steadied himself on the edge of the stage. All he wanted was to go home and hold Mara in his arms, but he knew this night was not over. Octavia was still there, and he had no idea what her next move would be. Eustace was still on stage, dazed by the murmurs and looks of surprise around him, when his phone vibrated in his pocket. At first he ignored it, thinking it was just another unknown number, but the persistent ringing made him answer. On the other end of the line, Mrs. Adeline's voice was trembling and filled with concern. "Eustace, it's Mara. She had another episode. I brought her to the emergency room, but it's packed here and she needs help now." He froze. The world around him seemed to stop as those words echoed in his mind. Without a second thought, he stepped down from the stage, ignoring the curious glances of the guests and Caldwell's confused calls. Octavia watched him, still paralyzed by the revelation she had just heard. Her eyes followed his every move as he rushed out of the hall. Outside, the cold night air felt like a knife against his skin, but Eustace barely noticed. His steps were hurried and awkward as he tried to process the urgency of the situation. He needed to get to the hospital. He needed to be with Mara. In the hall, Octavia stood still for a few seconds before finally stepping out. There was something in that moment, something in Eustace's eyes as he left, that made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the weight of guilt beginning to solidify in her heart. Resolute, she grabbed her bag and called for the driver to follow him. Meanwhile, in the overcrowded emergency room, Mara lay on an improvised stretcher in the corridor, surrounded by people coughing and groaning in pain. The environment was chaotic, with overworked nurses rushing back and forth. Mrs. Adeline was by her side, holding her hand and murmuring words of comfort, though her own worry was evident in every line of her face. Mara was pale, her breathing shallow. Her eyes blinked slowly, struggling to stay open. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's coming, dear," Mrs. Adeline said, squeezing her hand. "He'll be here soon." When Eustace finally arrived at the hospital, he pushed the doors open forcefully, breathless and desperately searching for Mara. He spotted Mrs. Adeline and ran to her. His eyes locked onto his daughter's fragile figure, and he felt his heart shatter into a million pieces. "Mara." He knelt beside her, holding her cold hand in his. "I'm here, my love. Daddy's here." Mara tried to smile, but it was clear she was exhausted. "You came," she murmured before closing her eyes again. Eustace looked at Mrs. Adeline, desperation evident in his voice. "Aren't they doing anything? She needs help." "They're overwhelmed, Eustace," the elderly woman replied, tears in her eyes. "They said she needs urgent tests, but the waiting list is huge. I don't know what else to do." Eustace felt as if the ground was opening beneath his feet. He tried to speak with the nurses but received the same responses. A lack of resources, priority patients, tests that could take days. He returned to Mara, squeezing her hand as tears streamed down his face. Suddenly, the sound of heels echoed down the corridor. He turned and saw Octavia approaching, her face even more rigid than usual, but there was something different in her gaze. There was a crack in the facade of coldness she had maintained so carefully. "What's going on?" she asked, looking from Eustace to Mara. He didn't respond immediately. His mind was too occupied with despair, but Octavia took another step forward. "How long has she been like this?" "This is none of your business," he replied, unable to contain the bitterness in his voice. Octavia ignored the tone and stepped closer to the girl. "She needs better care. This place won't help her." Eustace stood up, facing her with red, angry eyes filled with pain. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I wouldn't do anything to get my daughter out of here? I've done everything I could." Octavia hesitated, her face hardening for a moment before softening. She looked at Mara again, her eyes lingering on the girl's frail figure. Something within her seemed to change. "I'll pay for her treatment," she finally said, her voice low, almost hesitant. Eustace blinked, confused. He took a step back as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "What?" "You heard me. I'll pay to have her transferred to a private clinic. She will get the care she needs." There was silence between them, interrupted only by the sounds of chaos in the corridor. Finally, Eustace found his voice. "Why? After everything you've done, why are you doing this now?" Octavia looked away, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Maybe I'm trying to fix something. I don't know." "What do you think you need to fix?" He stepped closer, his voice rising. "Fix the humiliation you put me through? Or fix your own conscience because you know you were wrong?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took out her phone and made a quick call, ordering an ambulance to be sent to the hospital. When she hung up, she turned to him, her eyes shining behind a mask of broken pride. "You can hate me as much as you want, Eustace, but this isn't about you, it's about her." Silence fell between them again as they waited for the ambulance. When it finally arrived, the paramedics placed Mara on a stretcher and began preparing her for transfer. Eustace stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand as she was wheeled out to the ambulance. Octavia watched from a distance, arms crossed, but there was something different in her posture. As Eustace walked past her to enter the ambulance, he paused. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice steady. She looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't identify. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope she has a chance." Eustace didn't respond. He stepped into the ambulance, and the door closed behind him. Octavia stood alone in the parking lot, watching the ambulance lights fade into the night. As the ambulance drove through the streets, Eustace felt a mix of relief and confusion. Was Octavia really trying to help? Or was there something more behind her sudden change of heart? He looked at Mara, who was unconscious but seemed a little more at peace. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. Yet something in Octavia's words before their parting still troubled him. "I need to fix what I did." What did she really mean by that? What did she think needed fixing? Eustace knew there was more to this story, and he was determined to find out. The private clinic where Mara was admitted felt like a completely different world from the public hospital where she had spent the last few hours. The soft lighting, the immaculate white sheets, and the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic sounds of medical equipment created an almost surreal sense of calm for Eustace. He sat by his daughter's bedside, holding her small hand in his eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. Finally, Mara was receiving the care she so desperately needed, and he allowed himself, for a brief moment, to feel relief. But Octavia's constant presence loomed in his mind. He knew she had a reason for being there, something that went beyond the compassion she had shown in the hospital. Since Mara's transfer, Eustace had noticed Octavia's discreet presence. Whenever he stepped out to get water or speak to the doctors, he found traces of her. A children's book left on the bedside table, a carefully arranged package of sweets, fresh flowers in a vase. She never announced herself, but her actions spoke volumes. It was strange to think that the same woman who had humiliated him so many times was now so concerned for his daughter. One morning, while adjusting Mara's pillow, Eustace heard soft footsteps outside the room. He stepped into the hallway and, to his surprise, saw Octavia talking to a nurse. She appeared uncomfortable, as if each word cost her a great deal of effort. Upon noticing Eustace, she abruptly turned but couldn't hold his gaze. "I just wanted to know how she is," Octavia said hesitantly. Eustace crossed his arms, trying to control his tone. "She's better, thanks to the care she should have received from the start." Octavia looked away, biting her lower lip. I'm sorry for everything." He didn't respond immediately, just stared at her, trying to decipher her intentions. Finally, he shook his head. Saying sorry won't erase what happened. Before she could reply, the sound of firm footsteps echoed down the corridor. Caldwell appeared, bringing with him a worn leather briefcase. He greeted Eustace with a discreet nod, and upon noticing Octavia, his expression grew serious. "Octavia," he said without preamble, "we need to talk." She crossed her arms, an automatic barrier against any attack. "If it's to accuse me of something, I've heard enough." "It's not an accusation," Caldwell said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "It's a request. You've done a lot to help Mara, but now you need to do what's right by Eustace. He deserves your public absolution." Eustace remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Octavia looked poised to retort, but Caldwell continued. "I was there, Octavia. I saw how he tried to alert the management about the problems at the factory. He was not to blame for what happened, but your insistence on turning him into the villain helps no one, not even you." The words struck Octavia like a blow. She took a step back, fists clenched. "And what do you suggest, that I simply forget everything? That I ignore the fact that I lost my father because no one did anything?" "Your father died because the owners of the factory ignored the warnings," Caldwell said, his voice now filled with gravity. Eustace was a victim, just like you." Octavia turned her face away, but not before Caldwell noticed the tears beginning to well up in her eyes. Without saying anything more, she hurried away, entering the nearest bathroom and locking the door behind her. Eustace and Caldwell stood there unsure of what to do. The silence in the corridor felt oppressive. After a few minutes, Caldwell sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. "She's fighting against herself, Eustace. I know this pain. It's hard to admit you were wrong, especially when you're carrying so much hurt." Eustace merely shook his head. "That doesn't help Mara, nor does it change what she put me through." Caldwell placed a hand on his shoulder. "Give her time. Sometimes people need to face their own ghosts before they can find the right path." Meanwhile, inside the bathroom, Octavia was falling apart. Sitting on the cold floor, hugging her knees, she cried silently. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories of her father, the fire, the anger that had consumed her for so many years. She had always believed she was doing the right thing by punishing Eustace, but now everything felt uncertain. The image of Mara, so small and fragile, haunted her. How could she continue to fuel that cycle of pain? When Octavia finally emerged, her face was swollen, but her expression was determined. She walked past Eustace and Caldwell without saying a word, heading back to the car waiting outside. Hours later, Mara opened her eyes. Still weak, there was a renewed sparkle in her gaze. She smiled when she saw her father by her side. "Daddy." "I'm here, my love," Eustace said, holding her hand. Mara looked around as if searching for something or someone. "And the lady, the one who brought the flowers? Where is she?" Eustace was taken aback. "You saw Octavia?" Mara nodded, a light smile on her face. "She always came when you weren't here. I know she did bad things, but I think she's trying to be good now." Mara's words echoed in Eustace's mind. As much as he wanted to hold on to his anger and resentment, it was difficult to ignore the fact that, without Octavia, Mara might not be alive now. He looked at his daughter, who had fallen asleep again, and felt a different weight in his chest. It was no longer just pain or anger, it was doubt. The next day, as Eustace sat by Mara's bedside, he heard familiar footsteps. He turned to see Octavia standing in the doorway, holding a small package in her hands. She looked hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Mara asked for you," he said, breaking the silence. Octavia stepped into the room, placing the package on the table. "I just wanted to leave this for her." Eustace watched her for a moment before finally saying, "She thinks you're trying to change. Maybe she's right." Octavia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at Mara, who was sleeping peacefully. "I just don't want her to suffer like I did." There was a heavy silence between them. Finally, Octavia took a deep breath and turned to Eustace. "I promise I won't do anything against you anymore. I need to fix what I did." Eustace nodded but said nothing. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for now, that was enough. As Octavia left the room, Eustace wondered if she was truly ready to take the next step. Her wounds were still open, just like his. But maybe, just maybe, there was hope that they could both find redemption. What Octavia would do next was a mystery, but he knew their journey was far from over. The weeks that followed Mara's recovery brought palpable changes in Eustace's life. The permanent air of exhaustion that had settled on his face slowly began to fade, replaced by an expression of serenity he hadn't felt in a long time. The steady job at the small workshop, secured with Caldwell's help, provided him with a sense of security that had once seemed unattainable. For the first time in years, he could pay the rent without fear of eviction and ensure a decent food routine for Mara. She, in turn, seemed to blossom more each day, reclaiming her little dreams and the playful spirit that so defined her personality. In the community, Octavia's presence became a continuous surprise. Once seen as a cold and distant figure, she was now actively promoting initiatives to support families who had also suffered from the fire's aftermath. She established a community fund for former factory employees and their families, something that, while it couldn't erase the past, helped to build a more promising future for many. Her father's name was associated with these changes, no longer as a negligent businessman, but as someone whose memory inspired transformation. It was evident that the open wound in Octavia still hurt. She wore a more serene but introspective expression and kept a certain distance from Eustace and Mara, even as she promoted these improvements. It was as if she wanted to do good without expecting recognition, perhaps believing that forgiveness, both hers and that of others, was something that needed to be earned, not forced. The neighborhood felt like a different reality when the small festival was organized. Food stalls, live music, and laughter filled the previously desolate space. Children ran excitedly from one side to the other while adults chatted about the new atmosphere of hope that enveloped the community. Mara, wearing a new dress bought by Eustace, couldn't stop smiling as she helped organize one of the lemonade stands. Eustace stood alongside Caldwell, who was adjusting a piece of paper in his hands, preparing to give a brief speech. The festive atmosphere was infectious, but Eustace knew that this moment was bigger than just a party. It was a milestone, a chance to start anew. Caldwell stepped onto the makeshift stage and, with a firm voice, called the crowd's attention. "Today is not just a day of celebration," he began, holding the microphone confidently. "It is a day to remember where we came from and to recognize the people who, even in difficult times, never gave up on fighting for a better future." He paused, his gaze meeting Eustace's in the crowd. "I want to share something with you that many may not know. There was a time when a tragedy struck our community, a devastating fire that destroyed not just a factory but dreams and entire lives. At that time, some were unjustly blamed for something they could not prevent. Eustace was one of those people." A murmur began to ripple through the crowd. Caldwell raised his hand, asking for silence. Eustace tried to raise the alarm about the dangers that existed in that factory. He did what he could, even when he lacked the power or voice to change the board's decisions. He is an example of resilience and dignity, even in the face of such great injustices. Applause began tentatively but soon filled the air. Eustace, visibly emotional, tried to stay composed as neighbors approached him, shaking his hand and congratulating him. Mara, beaming with pride, ran to him and hugged him, her laughter blending with the applause around them. However, while everyone was immersed in the celebration, Eustace noticed a figure standing at the back, almost hidden in the shadows. Octavia. She was there, but hesitant, not mingling with the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on Eustace and Mara, and for a brief moment he thought he saw a flicker of regret in her gaze. Before he could decide what to do, Mara, as always, was quicker. She let go of her father's hand and ran toward Octavia. "You came!" she exclaimed, hugging her spontaneously. Octavia, caught off guard, froze in place, unsure how to react. But the sincerity in the girl's gesture was undeniable. Eventually, she returned the hug, her hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around Mara's small shoulders. "Thank you," Mara said, looking directly into Octavia's eyes, "for everything you did for me." Octavia blinked, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "You are a special girl, Mara," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't deserve your gratitude, but I'm glad you're doing well." Eustace approached slowly, watching the scene with a mix of caution and curiosity. When he got close enough, Octavia released Mara and turned to him, clearly nervous. I don't know what to say," she began, looking at the ground. "I know what I did was unforgivable, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. For her, for you." Eustace stared at her for a long moment before responding. "I don't know if I can forget everything, Octavia, but maybe what matters now is what we do moving forward." She nodded, understanding that full forgiveness would take time, perhaps never come entirely. But that moment, that brief gesture of understanding, was more than she had hoped for. As Mara tugged Octavia to show her the food stalls and games, Eustace lingered behind, watching the two. There was something extraordinary about seeing his daughter, so small, offering a gesture of kindness that seemed greater than any action he could have taken. For the first time in years, he felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. Not disappearing completely, but feeling lighter. In the distance, the sky began to fill with hues of orange and pink, signaling the end of a day that, despite its complexities, brought with it the promise of new beginnings.
The story of Eustace, Mara, and Octavia reminds us that life's greatest battles are often fought in the heart. Eustace's relentless love for his daughter showed us the depth of a parent's sacrifice, while Octavia's journey revealed the power of understanding and forgiveness. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes the people we think are our enemies are carrying wounds of their own. This tale teaches us that compassion can heal even the deepest scars, and that dignity and kindness can transform lives. What did you take away from this story? How do you think compassion and forgiveness can change the world around us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another video. Give this video a thumbs up if it touched your heart and share your reflections in the comments. Also, don't forget to check out the next recommended story by clicking the card on your screen. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.